what does the Dalai Lama actually want to achieve? I mean, we've seen this before, and I don't see that he's achieved much at all. As a matter of fact, it might be just counterproductive.
There are two sides to it. One is that we have in the United States, especially in Hollywood, a coterie of wealthy mystics who have made the Dalai Lama into a kind of a hobby. On the other hand, though, remember, the United States regards Tibet as an integral part of China. That has never changed. Nobody has ever recognized the Dalai Lama as a government in exile, although he tries to behave as one. And the inherent problem that the Dalai Lama has is he says, I'm a religious leader, but of course he was the head of this regime in Tibet up until about 1959, which was this feudal manorial system where you had, I guess you'd call it Caesaropapism. In other words, the emperor and the pope were the same person, the Dalai Lama, and he was a living god. So now he says, I'm only doing the religious side, not the political side. He has at various times demanded the complete independence of Tibet, which has not really been a reality since about 1600, 1700, or thereabouts. So therefore, there is a great mistrust. And generally speaking, he has this past record of having participated in all of these CIA operations.
Oh, exactly.
His immediate family.
You preempted me. That's what I wanted to talk about. Andrew, if we can go back to you in Brussels, I mean, you know, why should the Chinese look at the United States as just meeting the Dalai Lama for religious purposes or something like that? I mean, the history of CIA involvement in Tibet is very long. It's very public. It's very well known. And, you know, and this is a good reason why the Chinese are upset, and they have a good reason to be, I would say.
Well, obviously, but the reality is the Dalai Lama is an international icon. He's a Nobel Prize laureate, and obviously he's received quite favorably by the world's leaders. And I was referring to the internal politics in America. So all these realities have got to be taken into account. But China is now in a dilemma. Of course, as I said, I mean, China doesn't trust the Dalai Lama in spite of what he says. And also, China puts a lot of energy resources in building up the standard of living of the Tibetan people. I mean, you talk about religion. I mean, religion is not forbidden. I mean, the religion is allowed to be practiced. And also, the standard of living is rising quite rapidly, according to the United Nations development indexes. But in spite of that, there is a huge influx of the Han Chinese there, and it causes a lot of problems. So I think China needs to manage this quite rapid transition economically. And also, the Tibetans, compared with the Han Chinese, they are less able to compete in this kind of open economy. So that question has got to be addressed. But there is no question that it's a very huge question for China. It's not just Tibet, because it could be the start of a domino affecting provinces like Xinjiang. And even Tibet is a huge province. And apart from the size, it's also the source of fresh water supply, a source of minerals and energy supplies routes. So it's a lot of strategic interest for China. But China needs to manage this very, very carefully. And of course, it's a very, very sensitive point for China.
Webster, if I can go to you, has the Hollywoodization of the Dalai Lama in Tibet actually hurt their case? Because it's not this idyllic place. It never really was. And so, you know, there's this expectation of the Dalai Lama, and what, you know, Americans and Europeans, they worship something that doesn't exist, never did. And it affects politics.
I think you're right. The Hollywood mystical community is convinced that there was this Shangri-La, a golden age, where everybody lived in harmony with nature, where there was no conflict. And of course, Tibetan history is anything but. The reality we see is a manorial system. In other words, it's something that you had in Western Europe in the Dark Ages, with serfs, about 75% of the population being serfs, maybe 5% actual slaves in households usually, a tiny class, about 200 families controlling 93% of the wealth, maybe 400 or 500 people actually running the society, being the beneficiaries, and a very, very onerous regime. It was a brutal feudal theocracy where the favorite punishments were mutilation of the eye, the hand, the foot, the tongue, and all kinds of travel reporters going to Tibet in the 50s and 60s would report the large presence of people in marketplaces who had their hands or other limbs cut off. So this is what it was. This was not spiritual. This is a myth, essentially, which has appealed to people from from Heinrich Himmler, who sent an expedition to Tibet, all the way to Richard Gere and Sharon Stone. And it is simply a myth. And we cannot base the foreign policy of the United States on a myth tinged with mysticism about Shangri-La. And that is, unfortunately, what a very significant group in the Democratic Party wants to do. Well, we can see from what the U.S. government is doing that the idea of a color revolution in China is never far below the surface. And they'd like to start in Tibet if they could. They might want to start with the World Uyghur Congress in Xinjiang. They'd like to foment all kinds of trouble in Taiwan, although that's not going too well at the time. They're looking at a youth bulge in China, and they figure there might be 20, 30 million young people who are essentially ready to be duped, who think that the U.S. is cool and that what they see on the Internet is reality. And I think Tibet fits into that. Let me just go back, though. The issue of support. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, with his CIA advisors, fomented a violent rebellion against the People's Liberation Army. And what you saw was that the common people did not join in, that the rich aristocrats thought that this was great. Common people didn't go with it. And I think the most eloquent quotation I've seen from a sort of Tibetan man in the street, person in the street, was, I was a serf under the previous regime. I'm not really as free as I'd like to be under China, but I'm a heck of a lot better off than I was as a serf. And I think that's the point, that the Chinese built the first hospital, the first roads, railroad. They abolished slavery, abolished serfdom, abolished feudal dues. There was actually the corvée, like in medieval Europe, that you had to do forced labor for these aristocrats. If they wanted you to go out and transport goods, you had to go and do that. So this was extremely oppressive, and most of that has been gotten rid of. A lot of people in Tibet, I think, would welcome the Dalai Lama if he stuck to religion. But there's always this political overtone. And remember, when you get the Dalai Lama, it's not just a person. Right. It's this court. He's got a gaggle of feudal landowners in northern India. They get $2 million a year from the United States government, a lot more money from George Soros and his foundations. And the idea is that they want to go back. Now, I don't think they really imagine that they could reimpose the manorial system of feudalism, but I think what they would is a very brutal shock therapy, therapy for Tibet.
Webster, it's very interesting is because the Dalai Lama has wrapped himself up in the flag of democracy lately, but still, given its very long history with CIA support, covert support, I mean, there are people that are coming out of around the Dalai Lama, people that are more discouraged, saying, this is just a frontier, and I'd like to go to Andrew about that. I mean, has the Dalai Lama just adopted democracy just to appeal to his Western friends and fundraisers?
Well, certainly there was not much democracy, you know, when the Dalai Lama was in power in Tibet before.